وعلى آلك وأصحابك يا رحمة للعالمين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh to Maulana, to all the participants.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Welcome to tonight's session, and I hand over to Maulana, inshallah.
Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillahi hamdan kathiran tayyiban mubarakan fih, wal awwal wal akhir wal zahir wal batin, wa huwa bi kulli shay'in alim. Amma ba'd, fa'a'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Afara'aytum ma tumnun, a'antum takhluqunahu am nahnu al-khaliqun. Sadaqallahu al-azim. Sallallahu ala nabiyil ummi wa alihi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Salatu wa salamun alayka ya Rasulullah sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wa sallam. My respected listeners and viewers, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. All praise is due to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, our cherisher and our sustainer, and choices of durood and salam be upon his beloved, our master, arwahuna fida Sayyidina Muhammadur Rasulullah sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wa sallam. When we look at the Holy Quran, we find that it encompasses all of the sciences that we can think of in this modern day and age, whether it is with regard to biology, whether it was with regard to physics or mathematics or zoology or astrology, cosmology, any science that we can think of, the Holy Quran encompasses it. And this is why it is so important for us to read the Holy Quran, to understand the Holy Quran, so that we can see the marvels of the Qudrat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We can ponder over the Qudrat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is a great ibadat in itself, just to ponder and retrospect and reflect on the power and the Qudrat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And inshallah, today we will be discussing one of these sciences, the science of embryology, which is mentioned in the Holy Quran, for us to understand, according to the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, how does an embryo form in the human, in a female womb, and how does that progress, and for us to look at some of the marvels of the Qudrat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Some of the verses that we will look at, obviously due to time constraints, we won't be able to cover everything, but we will cover this entire topic inshallah in over a period of a few sessions. So inshallah, today we'll discuss the first part of the aspect of embryology. So firstly, we need to understand what is embryology so that we can understand what we are actually discussing. Now, embryology is actually the study of the development of an embryo from the stage of the ovum fertilization all the way through to the fetal stage. So this is what embryology encompasses, starting at the fertilization stage, the formation of the embryo, and then the formation of the fetus. Now, having understood embryology, we turn to the Holy Quran to understand what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says with regard to this aspect, with regard to the science. And remember, this is something that was revealed more than 1400 years ago to Rasulullah sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wa sallam. And even though today medical science is discovering many of these things, but in actual fact, Rasulullah sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wa sallam had already mentioned these things to us more than 1400 years ago, when there were no universities teaching these kind of things and discussing these kind of sciences. So this again is the marvel of the infinite knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as well as the vast knowledge of Rasulullah sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wa sallam. Now, there are many verses in the Holy Quran that cover the aspects of embryology. Today, inshallah, I will just briefly discuss one verse that gives us an overview of what actually happens in the womb, and then we will discuss the first aspect of embryology, which is the fertilization stage. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Holy Quran in Surah Al-Mu'minun from verse 12 onwards, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ مِنْ سُلَالَةٍ مِنْ طِينٍ ثُمَّ جَعَلْنَاهُ نُطْفَةً فِي قَرَارٍ مَكِينٍ ثُمَّ خَلَقْنَا النُّطْفَةَ عَلَقَةً فَخَلَقْنَا الْعَلَقَةَ مُضْغَةً فَخَلَقْنَا الْمُضْغَةَ عِظَامًا فَكَسَوْنَا الْعِظَامَ لَحْمًا ثُمَّ أَنشَأْنَاهُ خَلْقًا آخَرَ فَتَبَارَكَ اللَّهُ أَحْسَنُ الْخَالِقِينَ. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Holy Quran in Surah Al-Mu'minun, indeed we created man from a chosen soil, from a selected soil. So first, with regard to the creation of man, of insan, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala refers to the initial creation of insan, which was from clay, from soil, when Sayyidina Adam alayhi salam was created. So this is the initial creation of insan. And thereafter, for every human to come into being in this dunya, then they had to undergo the entire process of embryology and eventually be born from a mother's womb. And then further, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, then made him a drop of fluid in a secure shelter. So first, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about the creation of man from clay, from soil. And then he mentions the secondary creation of insan to come into this dunya physically. And say, ثُمَّ جَعَلْنَاهُ نُطْفَةً فِي قَرَارٍ مَكِينٍ. Then made him a drop of fluid in a secure shelter, the secure shelter refers to the womb. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, we then turned the drop of fluid into a clot of blood, then the clot into a small lump of flesh, then the lump into bones, then covered the bones with flesh, then developed it into a different mold. Therefore, most auspicious is Allah, the best creator. So from this, we can understand the various stages of the embryology and what happens in the womb. And again, this is a vast a verse to discuss in itself. And inshallah, in one of the next sessions, we will discuss this in more detail. But I just wanted to show us what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Holy Quran with regard to the various stages of embryology that takes place within the womb of the mother. And as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes that, first it is a drop of fluid, which then turns into a clot of blood. Then that clot of blood then turns into a lump of flesh. Then the lump of flesh is then converted into bones where necessary. And then the bones then get covered with flesh. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala provides a mold for that human that is about to be born. So these are the various stages. And there are a hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wa sallam that correlate to this and provide more detail with regard to this verse, especially in terms of the timelines of how long each stage takes, as well as when the ruh, etc., gets blown into the fetus. So that will come at a later stage. So today we will discuss the first aspect of it in terms of man being created, insan being created from a drop of semen. Now, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the verse that I recited at the beginning, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أَفْرَأَيْتُمْ مَا تُمْنُونَ أَأَنْتُمْ تَخْلُقُونَهُ أَمْ نَحْنُ الْخَالِقُونَ. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says and asks a rhetorical question. So what is your opinion regarding the semen you discharge? And this is in Surah Al-Waqi'ah in verse 58 and 59. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asks a rhetorical question. So what is your opinion regarding the semen you discharge? Now, this rhetorical question is there to make us understand, firstly, that if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is referring to the semen that is being discharged, then there is some marvel of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's qudrat that we need to ponder over. And secondly, when this kind of rhetorical question is asked, obviously, what is the worth of our opinion? The only thing that we can have an opinion about with regard to the qudrat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that those marvels of his qudrat are beyond our understanding, beyond our imagination. And all we can do is but marvel and say subhanallah and realize that the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is infinite. His wisdom is infinite and his qudrat is infinite. And he does what he wills. And when we ponder over the intricacies of how these things happen, then all we can do is marvel and say subhanallah. And this is what, when we discuss some of these things, we'll realize that the only thing that comes to mind and comes to a person's lips when we hear about these things is to say subhanallah. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أَأَنْتُمْ تَخْلُقُونَهُ أَمْ نَحْنُ الْخَالِقُونَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asks another question and says, do you make a human out of it? Meaning, so first Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asks, so what is your opinion regarding the semen you discharge? And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asks, do you make a human out of it? Or is it we who create? So here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is showing us how helpless we are, even though we are the ones that discharge the semen. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is showing us that we are absolutely helpless. We are absolutely powerless. We are not the ones who create. It is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who is the creator. We are just a means of transferring that semen. And when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wills from that semen for there to be an offspring, then there will be. And if he wills for there not to be an offspring, then there won't be. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in these questions, in these verses of Surah Waqiyah, is showing us His qudrat, His power, and is showing us that we need to ponder over these things and ponder over this semen. Now, I'm going to go into a bit more detail with regard to the semen for us to understand what a marvel the semen is. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asks, what is your opinion about the semen that you discharge? So it is important for us to understand, what is the semen, what does it consist of, and how do these interactions take place between the male reproductive system and the female reproductive system. And this in itself is an extreme marvel and qudrat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions the semen. Now, semen in itself, this is a fluid. And this is made up of sperm, and it is made up of fluids that are made up in certain parts of the male reproductive system. And the two main parts where they are made, this fluid, is the prostate gland and the seminal vesicles. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of the biology behind these things and the chemistry, because obviously that will become too detailed for us to understand. I'm going to try and keep the discussion simple so that at a high level we can marvel at the qudrat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that takes place at a microscopic level without us realizing, without us actually seeing these things, and without us actually pondering over what happens at such an instant speed that we don't even realize that when the semen is being discharged, these are the kind of interactions and the chemical interaction that takes place between the male and the female reproductive system, all which encompass the qudrat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, firstly, in the semen itself, when a person discharges his semen, there are approximately 200 to 300 million sperms that are found in that semen. And from that 200 to 300 million sperms that are discharged, only about 1,000 reach the actual egg, the ovum, in the female reproductive system. So again, this is the marvel of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that this is the number of sperms that are discharged every time, between 200 to 300 million of them. And now this is obviously the general number. Obviously you get less and you get more than that, but this is the general amount that of sperm that is discharged. And from that, only 1,000 actually reach the egg, and from that 1,000, only one manages to fertilize the egg. Subhanallah. So again, this shows us the shan, the qudrat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that He has already ordained which one sperm from that 200 to 300 million are going to fertilize that egg, if it is going to fertilize that egg. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has already ordained for that specific one. And even if the entire dunya together tries to change that, they cannot change it, because this is the qudrat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is His will. And we can see the wisdom in His creation and the way He has devised this entire process of embryology to take place and the process of fertilization to take place, that there's so many millions of these that actually enter the female body. But from all of that, only 1,000 reaches the egg, and from those 1,000, only one manages to actually fertilize the egg. Subhanallah. The second marvel is that if we look at the testes, where the sperms are made, where they are produced, this is the only part of the human body that is actually external to the human body in the man. So you will find all of the other organs are internal to the human body, and this is because the entire body manages and survives at a temperature of approximately 37 degrees. But this is the qudrat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that sperm, even though it is part of the same body, it is manufactured in the same body, but sperm itself will die at a temperature of 37 degrees. And this is why sperm cannot survive inside the human body. And this is why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created it such that the testes are found external to the actual body and external to the rest of the organs. Again, this is the marvel and the qudrat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with regard to the semen. Remember, we are still discussing the semen which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned in the Holy Quran and asked us what is our opinion with regard to the semen that we discharge. So this is why we are focusing on the semen and trying to understand the first part of the embryology, which is the fertilization phase. Now, in terms of the other constituents of semen, so like I said, the one constituent is sperm, and the other constituents are fluids. Fluids created in the man's reproductive system, and these come from the prostate gland and the seminal vesicles. Now again, when we look at these chemicals that are produced, when we look at what is produced and how it is produced and how it actually functions to facilitate the fertilization process, it is just but a marvel, subhanallah. So to give you a glimpse, an overview, when we look at what happens in the male reproductive system, for example, in the prostate gland, it is as if the prostate gland knows exactly where the sperm is going to go, knows exactly what the environmental conditions is of the place where the sperm is going to go, knows exactly what the chemical composition is of that place, knows what it needs to do in order to eradicate any adverse environmental conditions and to facilitate favorable conditions so that this sperm can actually reach its goal. Subhanallah. And this all happens in the man's body without it having any connection with the female body. It is as if it knows what it needs to do, it knows where the final destination of the sperm is, and it knows exactly what to do in order to facilitate that. And again, no organ, no body, and no any creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can have knowledge by itself of what to do and when to do it. This is all the qudrat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and all of these things happen every minute, every second, everywhere in the world at any given point in time. There are several people that are conceiving, there are several people that are being born, there are several females that have the entire process of the embryology taking place in various stages in their bodies. And in each one of them, all of these things happen with perfection through the hukum and the qudrat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So again, this is all through understanding how the semen works and what happens when it enters the female body. Now, let us take some examples to understand exactly what I am saying when I say that these fluids know exactly what to do and where the final destination is of the sperm. So looking at the prostate, if we look at the prostate, it produces various chemicals. Now again, it produces these chemicals in order to make the conditions conducive in the female body for the sperm to travel. So everything in the human body, in the man's body, basically facilitates the traveling of the sperm to its final destination. And one of the things that happens in the female body is that the medium inside the uterus, inside the female body, inside the fallopian tubes, the medium there is acidic. And in the acidic medium, sperm's movement gets inhibited. So sperm cannot move properly within an acidic medium, and the acid medium actually kills the sperm. So now, in the semen, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's qudrat is such that when the sperm is about to be released, it mixes with fluid coming from the prostate gland. And this prostate gland has certain chemicals within it that actually, when it enters into the female body, then that chemical neutralizes the acidic medium within the female body and allows the sperm to actually start moving freely and moving more efficiently so that it can reach its final destination. Subhanallah. So this is how within the male's body we find these things taking place before it actually enters the female body, knowing where it needs to go and what it needs to do in that medium. Then when we look at the fluid that comes from the seminal vesicles, now the fluid that gets manufactured in the seminal vesicles, this also creates various chemicals. And one of the things it does is it creates fructose. Now, fructose is that compound that provides energy for the sperm to move within the female body to reach its destination. And then it also produces prostaglandins. And this is actually, when I read this, it was just a marvel, and all I could say was say subhanallah and glorify Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for his qudrat and his wisdom in how he has created all of these things so meticulously, and everything functions so perfectly. So these prostaglandins, they are a compound that actually makes the environment within the female conducive for these sperms to move freely. And one of the things it also does is these prostaglandins cause reverse contractions in the uterus and the fallopian tubes. Now, generally we would know that when the ovum is released, it travels down the fallopian tube, and this is how the ovum actually travels down towards the uterus. Now, obviously, if the sperm had to travel upwards while these contractions are taking place in a downward fashion, then it would be like trying to ice skate uphill, or it would be trying to swim against the tide. And it would require a lot more effort and energy from the sperm to actually swim against the tide, so to speak. So these prostaglandins actually, as soon as they enter into the female body, they cause reverse contractions, and they cause the fallopian tubes to contract in the opposite direction to help the sperm actually move faster towards its final destination, which is the ovum. Subhanallah. So all of this happens in the male body, knowing that this is what we need to secrete, this is what we need to manufacture in order to facilitate what is happening in the female body, so that we can make sure that we enable the sperm to reach their final destination, which is the ovum that sits in the fallopian tube. Subhanallah. So this again is the marvel of the qudrat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now when we look at the sperm itself, now obviously due to time constraints, I'm not going to go into all of the chemical compounds that are found within the semen. Just to give you an example, there are so many different chemical compounds, and like I said at the beginning, I'm simplifying this, but just to give an example, within the semen, it is such a complex fluid that you find various complex compounds such as fructose, ascorbic acid, flavins, prostaglandins, citric acid, cholesterol, zinc, acid phosphatase, lactic acid, sperm, etc., and many other compounds and chemical compounds. So these are many things that happen, and each one of these things has a purpose that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created it for. I've just given you one or two examples so that we can get the gist of how these things happen at such a complex and intricate nature, and yet when it happens, we don't even realize what is actually happening. So this is the qudrat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with regard to these things happening in the semen. Now, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala again mentions in the Holy Quran with regard to the semen in another verse, and I'm mentioning this here is because today science has discovered that it is not the entire semen that is discharged that actually fertilizes the ovum, the egg. It is only one sperm from there that actually fertilizes the egg. Everything else, all of the fluid, etc., is there to facilitate and enable that one sperm to fertilize that egg. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had mentioned this in the Holy Quran more than 1400 years ago, that this is a mixture of fluid. So again, we understand from the Holy Quran that the body creates this fluid, and like I had explained, that there's a mixture of different fluids coming from different parts of the body, and this also then mixes with the fluid in the female body. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Inna khalaqnal insana min nutfatin amshaj nabtalihi faja'alnahu sami'an basira. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, indeed we have created man from mixed semen in order to test him. We therefore made him hearing, seeing. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala here mentions that man has been created from mixed semen. Now I have mentioned one aspect of the mixed semen, that you have these fluids in the semen that come from different parts of the man's body. But now in various tafasir, in Tafsir Khazan al-Irfan, Tafsir Mazhari, etc., it is mentioned that this mixed semen refers to the fluids of the man and the fluids of the female that combine during the consummation process, and that enables the fertilization to take place. Because apart from the chemical compounds that are found in the male's body that facilitate the movement of sperm, there are also chemicals that are found and secreted in the female's fluid at that time that also facilitate the movement of the sperm. Subhanallah. So again, it is as if the female body's reproductive system, without knowing what the male reproductive system, without having any contact with the male reproductive system, the female reproductive system knows in what medium those sperm need to travel, and in what conditions they travel, and what are the physical characteristics of those sperm, and what we need to do within the female reproductive system in order to facilitate enabling that sperm to reach its final destination, which is the ovum in the female body. Subhanallah. And all this happens instantaneously. So let us understand then again some of the examples of what I'm mentioning. Now, the sperm has a head, as many of us know, and it has a tail. The tail helps it to swim, and the head is what ultimately needs to penetrate into the egg. Now, the head of the sperm has a protective covering known as the acrosome. Now, the acrosome covers enzymes that are found in the head. And the purpose of these enzymes are when they reach the ovum, then these enzymes enable the sperm to actually penetrate into the egg. So it basically helps to dissolve the surface of the egg so that the sperm can penetrate and go through. Now, the marvel of this is that when the sperm is in the man's body, then firstly, its movement is subdued. Why? Because it is in storage. And there's no need for unnecessary movement because it's going to use unnecessary energy. Again, this is the qudrat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and also showing us efficiency and conserving energy. Today, sometimes we waste electricity, we waste water, etc. And when we look at these things at this micro level, at this microscopic level, it teaches us a lesson of not wasting. So even at this stage, when the sperm are being stored in the man's body, then there are chemicals released to subdue their movement because they don't need to move. They are in storage. And only when they are discharged into the female's body, that is when their movement starts to accelerate. And this is when the chemicals in the semen and the chemicals in the female's fluid actually enable and accelerate the movement of the sperm. Now, another marvel is that this acrosome, when it is in the man's body, when it is in storage, then within the male reproductive system, there are high levels of cholesterol that are produced. And the reason for this is that the acrosome is covering the enzymes that need to penetrate into the egg. And because it's in the male's body, right now, those enzymes don't need to be released because they will get wasted. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made it such that within the male's body, there's a high level of cholesterol. And what that does is it hardens the acrosome, the covering of those enzymes, so that it does not dissolve and release the enzymes. But then as soon as that sperm is released into the female's body, then the female's body knows already that these sperms are coming with fluid, with semen that has high levels of cholesterol. So what they do is, in the female's body, the female body secretes a fluid that neutralizes the cholesterol and lowers the level of cholesterol. And when that happens, then that softens the acrosome, that layer that is covering the enzymes, which enables that sperm, when it reaches the egg, then it is able to release those enzymes that will then dissolve the surface of the ovum of the egg and enable that sperm to penetrate into that egg and cause fertilization. Subhanallah. Look at how intricate this is. Look at how meticulous this is. And this is all of this happens instantaneously within milliseconds. And we don't even realize these things. And yet this is all through the qudrat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. All of these things happen spontaneously without us having even being able to see it or even being able to witness it. But this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He asks us in the Holy Quran, that what is your opinion about the semen that is discharged? When we look at these things at a micro level, now we can understand the qudrat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We can understand how intricate these things are and how the entire human body works like a perfect machine that has been enabled by the qudrat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala meticulously for all of these things to happen with absolute synchronization, so that ultimately, with 200 to 300 million sperms traveling from the male body to the female body, ultimately all of these processes are taking place instantaneously around that one sperm that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has ordained that this is that sperm that is going to fertilize that egg. Subhanallah. This is why we need to learn the Holy Quran, read the Holy Quran, understand the Holy Quran, and then we'll be able to see the qudrat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We'll be able to ponder over His shan, over His knowledge, over His infinite wisdom, His infinite qudrat, that these are the things that happen around us and we are oblivious to it. Remember, the reason Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned these things in the Holy Quran is for us to ponder over them. Because pondering over the qudrat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala it is so meritorious that you get many years of making ibadat just by using one moment and spending one moment pondering over the qudrat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is just covering the first aspect in terms of the fertilization, where the sperm actually fuses into the ovum and fertilization occurs. Inshallah, in the upcoming sessions, we will discuss going from there how the embryo is formed and how the fetus is formed, understanding all of these things from the Holy Quran and also from the hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wasallam, and also understanding from what science has discovered now, so that it gives us a better idea at a micro level of the qudrat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that is taking place without us even realizing it. Jazakumullah. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم لسائر المؤمنين والمؤمنات إنه هو الغفور الرحيم.
Jazakallah Maulana. And all we can say is Subhanallah, Subhanallah, Subhanallah. Undoubtedly, we don't know what's happening around us, and in times like this, when Maulana is explaining, it makes a difference at least. Maulana, inshallah, like I said before we go, just a special request, dua for my daughter and the future husband, Hosbi Majida and Muhammad Amin. If you can make dua for them, inshallah, they're getting married this weekend. If you can please make dua for them.
Sorry, the names?
Hosbi Majida and Muhammad Amin.
Al-Fatiha. اللهم صل على سيدنا ومولانا محمد معدن الجود والكرم وآله وبارك وسلم. اللهم ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار وقنا عذاب القبر وقنا عذاب الحشر وقنا عذاب الفقر وقنا عذاب الدين. اللهم احفظنا من كل بلاء الدنيا وأشرار الدنيا وفتنة القبر وعذاب الآخرة. اللهم إنا نسألك العفو والعافية والمعافاة الدائمة في الدين والدنيا والآخرة. اللهم ربنا هب لنا من أزواجنا وذرياتنا قرة أعين واجعلنا للمتقين إماما. Oh Allah, Samir Bhai's daughter Majida and his and her bridegroom to be Muhammad Amin. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant them a successful nikah and marriage this weekend. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant them peace, happiness and tranquility in the marriage. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant them patience and understanding and selflessness and the ability to practice on the sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wasallam, and the ability to fulfill each other's rights, to understand firstly the rights of the spouse and to act upon it. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant them neck and pious children, healthy children that will become the coolness of their eyes. ببركة إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما. اللهم صل على سيدنا ومولانا محمد معدن الجود والكرم وآله وبارك وسلم بفضل سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين.
Shukran Jazil Maulana. Assalamu alaikum to Maulana and all the participants. We'll chat again next week. Assalamu alaikum.